High Stories channel here.
Today we're covering a 2009 American thriller called Grace. Let's get started. The film begins with a scene where a couple is making out on their bed. The girl remains insensitive to everything as her man is done. She simply stares blankly into space. We then see the couple is visited by their parents. The girl named Madeline spreads lunch around the table while her mother-in-law, Vivian, talks about how you can nurse even after menopause. As they all start having their lunch, Vivian urges Madeline to go see a real doctor like Richard Sohn in a hospital regarding her pregnancy, while constantly judging the food Madeline made. Ignoring Vivian's disrespectful gestures, Madeline explains she's going to see a midwife, and she stays adamant on that. The next scene pops up, and we see Madeline and her husband Michael visiting the clinic where the midwife named Patricia greets them and shows them around. Afterwards, they sit together and have a talk where Patricia proves that she's a qualified doctor with adequate experience. Furthermore, she provides Michael with the stats that women are more likely to die in hospitals rather than in a midwife's clinic. Later on, Madeline works in the kitchen and finds a piece of meat that Michael left for dinner. Madeline sighs and decides to prepare it. At the same time, her cat Jonesy brings a dead rat into the doors, so she takes it out and throws it in the bin. As night falls in, Madeline and Michael eat dinner. As he hungrily eats the meat, Madeline feels a sudden pain in her chest but ignores it. Just then, Michael gets a call from her mother, but as soon as he gets up, Madeline shudders with sheer pain in her chest. She whimpers in agony and is immediately taken to the hospital. In the hospital, Richard Sohn arrives and claims Madeline to be in a state of pre-ectoplasma, so they must induce her now. Madeline argues against it and urges Michael to call Patricia. Michael argues with his mother for a while as he states that Richard is not Madeline's doctor. In the meantime, Patricia arrives at the hospital and argues with the doctors and presents the actual report. As it's given, it's revealed that Dr. Sohn was falsifying the operation and there's no actual need for it. So like that, Patricia saves Madeline from the induction. As Michael and Madeline return from the clinic, a car malfunctions and crashes into a tree. After the accident, Michael sits unconscious with an injured head while a passerby gets close to the crashed SUV and witnesses Madeline sitting against a tree with her pants extremely bloodied. Following the tragic event, Madeline is taken to Patricia's clinic where she lays in bed totally traumatized. Despite the accident, Madeline is set on keeping the baby and delivering it on her own time in 3 weeks. On the other hand, we see that Vivian is deeply shocked upon hearing her son's demise, and she grieves. During all this time, Patricia keeps calling Madeline, but she's traumatized on her own. She simply stares back into the air. Afterwards, we see her at a toy store selecting plush toys for her child, but suddenly, her condition worsens and she bleeds through her legs and drops unconscious to the floor. Madeline is immediately taken to the clinic where she screams in agonizing pain while going into labor. The midwives support her and carry her into the bathtub where Patricia assists her in delivery. Madeline shrieks in pain as she struggles to push the baby out, and eventually the bathtub gets filled with blood and the baby is delivered. Unfortunately, it's a stillbirth and the baby is not breathing. Tears start flowing down Patricia's face as she holds the dead baby in her arms while Madeline is extremely exhausted and nearly faints. However, she asks Patricia to let her hold the baby, so she slides her in Madeline's arms and leaves. For the sake of motherly love, Madeline hugs her newborn infant and requests her to stay. As she whispers in her ear, Patricia and her assistant, Shelley, watch through the camera. Their helplessness is visible, and Patricia instantly decides to go to her, but as soon as she comes to Madeline, she watches a surprise that the baby is still alive, breathing and drinking Madeline's milk. Madeline names her daughter Grace, and the scene fades out. The next scene takes us to Madeline's house, where she receives a call from Vivian urging her to visit a proper doctor. Madeline ignores her and she goes to check on the door while Patricia arrives to visit her. After ending the call, Madeline welcomes her inside and Patricia offers her a bouquet of flowers while congratulating her. In the meantime, tension builds up between them and Patricia goes to the washroom. After returning, she gives Madeline some music records and a plush rat toy for Grace. In the meantime, Jonesy arrives there and Patricia picks him up while staring at the memories from their college times. Moreover, as Patricia tries to caress Madeline, an awkward situation is created, so Madeline asks her to leave at once. Later that night, Madeline wakes up from her sleep by Grace's voice coming through the speaker. As she goes to her room, she witnesses a housefly bothering Grace. Carefully, she picks up a magazine to kill the fly, but it crawls on Grace's face. Madeline gets scared for a while, but as soon as the fly takes flight, she smashes it against glass. Furthermore, she hangs sticky tape from the ceiling in order to catch the flies. Meanwhile, we see that Vivian is still under trauma after her son's death. She holds an old photograph of herself and Michael as she stares into the abyss. On the other hand, Madeline wakes up and senses a horrid smell in the house. She notices that Jonesy has littered all over the house, so she cleans it. Afterwards, she returns to Grace's crib and senses the same smell from her as well. But as she checks the diaper, it turns out completely clean. Considerably confused, Madeline proceeds to give Grace a bath, but the water immediately turns bloody and a rash appears on Grace's body. Therefore, she calls Patricia, but no one picks up, so Madeline leaves a message for her. Afterwards, Madeline proceeds with her nursing routine, but to her terror, she finds swarms of houseflies surrounding Grace's crib. Astonished and scared, she puts up many more tapes to catch the flies. In the meantime, we see Patricia seems troubled. Shelley arrives in her office and states that Madeline is sick. She notices that Patricia is trying to leave for vacation, which she takes personally. Moreover, she observes that Patricia is looking at an old photo of herself, Madeline and Jonesy. Shelley becomes jealous of her and leaves. On the other side, we see Madeline feeding her baby, but Grace begins to bite on her breast and it starts bleeding. Even so, Madeline doesn't shove her baby away and proceeds to keep going. Eventually, Grace vomits out a whitish liquid. The scene then shifts to Vivian, who checks herself to see if she's fit for breastfeeding. In another attempt, she forces her husband to activate her hormones so she can feed again. Back at Madeline's place, we witness that she's injured her breasts. She checks her wound while Patricia is parked outside her house, and just then, Grace starts crying again, and Madeline picks up to breastfeed her. It turns out that Grace doesn't drink milk at all, but to Madeline's astonishment, the baby feeds silently on her blood. Struck with horror, she picks up Grace and washes her bloodied mouth. The next morning, she goes to the supermarket and buys lots of meat. Upon returning home, she squeezes every bit of blood out and fills the feeder with the blood. Reluctant at first, she begins to feed it to Grace, and after a bit of struggle, the baby starts drinking. Leaving it to her, Madeline gets up and puts the leftover meat in the trash, but during that, Grace's condition begins to worsen, and she starts shaking violently. Madeline runs to her rescue and picks her up, but she throws up all the blood. Extremely terrified, Madeline calls Patricia, but Shelley states she's not in and asks to call another time. The next scene then pops up where Vivian visits Dr. Richard, who is actually a judge. While approaching him, Vivian puts forward a demand and states that she has lost her son. She doesn't want Madeline to have her granddaughter as well. Therefore, she would want Sohn to prepare a medical report dictating that Madeline is sick so she can claim the baby to herself. In return for a different favor, Sohn agrees. Following their meeting, Sohn takes a visit to Madeline's home, but she doesn't open the door and simply absorbs through the door eye. There, she witnesses that Sohn is outside and talking to Vivian about their plan. Madeline is now aware, so she hugs Grace closely and states that she is not going to let anyone take her away. Afterwards, she keeps feeding Grace her own blood, which constantly weakens her. Madeline starts feeling dizzy throughout her days as Grace sucks on her bloodied breasts. After the responsibility, she calls Patricia once again and pleads with her to make her call back. But we witness the reality that Shelley's never told Patricia about Madeline's calls in the first place. As Patricia inquires her about the caller, Shelley lies to her and tells her that it was the trailer guy. Patricia corrects her and tells her it's actually a motorhome and goes inside. In the meantime, Vivian calls Sohn once again and forces him to go back. As he agrees, she ends the call and opens a box in front of her. With childhood pictures spread out all around the room, Vivian takes out a suction device from the box and the scene fades out. On the other hand, Madeline's condition weakens, so she takes some pills for anemia and mixes them in a blender. Just then, Sohn arrives at her house, and just as the doors open, Madeline starts crying uncontrollably in front of him. He takes her inside and advises her to go to the hospital, which Madeline refuses to agree to. Therefore, he suggests doing an intrusive test on her to check the extent of her condition. Amidst the fear of the hospital, she agrees to go for the test. Meanwhile, we see that Vivian is testing herself as well for breastfeeding as she uses the suction machine to pump out milk. Back in Madeline's house, Sohn takes the benefit of her condition and makes her lift up and unbutton her shirt. As she does that, he uses the stethoscope to check her and then hands her a suction machine to take out some milk. Using a glass jar, he uses the pump to get the milk, but midway, he hears the baby crying. Immediately, he starts rushing towards the stairs while claiming that the baby is sick. Madeline runs after him while constantly trying to stop him. As he climbs the stairs, he calls Vivian to tell her about the situation, but Madeline comes from behind and shatters the glass jar on his head. Sohn stumbles to the floor and goes unconscious. On the other hand, Vivian gets restless and decides to go to Madeline's house to check on the situation. Meanwhile, Madeline dips her fingers in Sohn's blood and feeds it to Grace, whose suckling noises ring through the speakers. Afterwards, she drags his body to the bathroom and cuts his veins to fill the bottles with blood. Meanwhile, Patricia calls the motorhome and refers to Shelley, but the operator states that nobody named Shelley contacted them. Suspicion arises in Patricia's mind as she realizes Shelley had been lying to her. Midway through, we see Madeline is still filling up the feeding bottle when Vivian arrives at her house and comes inside the front door. She calls out and Madeline answers her while stating she's feeding the baby, so Vivian should stay downstairs and prepare for some tea for herself. As Vivian suspiciously stays behind, Madeline runs to the bathroom to feed the blood to Grace. Downstairs, Vivian's suspicion arises as she notices the smelly kitchen and listens to the suction voices through the speakers. Therefore, she proceeds upstairs while Madeline hurriedly changes into normal robes in the bathroom. Just as Vivian reaches the door, Madeline emerges and forcibly takes her downstairs to the kitchen. Once seated, Vivian discusses that Madeline needs to see a doctor, upon which Madeline replies that she's just sleepless, which has caused her condition to look like this. Upon that, Vivian pleads to take a look at Grace, but Madeline asks her to leave. Upon reaching the entrance, Vivian goes aside to the restroom, but behind Madeline's back, she sneaks upstairs where she finds the blood on the floor. In deep distress, she picks up the baby and slides a hammer into her bag. Afterwards, she runs to the bathroom where she comes across Stone's dead body. Shocked to the core, she hides behind the shower curtain when Madeline suddenly notices her movement. She runs upstairs and finds out that Grace has disappeared. She checks the bathroom, and behind her back, Vivian sneaks up past her and goes downstairs. Just as she's at the middle of the staircase, Madeline catches up to her and pleads with her to let Grace go, since she's special and needs special food. But Vivian doesn't listen to her and threatens her to stay away. Meanwhile, Patricia arrives at the house and a fight breaks out between the two inside. Vivian swings the hammer and hits Madeline in the head, which knocks her down and she starts bleeding. Horrified, she nears Madeline's face, who bites and takes a chunk of flesh from Vivian's neck. As the old woman gets back, Patricia runs inside and witnesses Madeline bleeding out to death. Then, Vivian also dies. With only Grace alive now, the screen blacks out. In the final moments of the film, we see Patricia on a road trip in her motorhome. She feeds Jonesy and proceeds to the back where Shelley is feeding Grace. But suddenly the horror is revealed as Shelley's feet are drenched with blood. Furthermore, the dread is intensified as Shelley lifts her shirt to show a ruptured chest. Due to Grace's developing teeth, the flesh is battered, and with that, the movie comes to an end. Drop a comment below letting me know how you found the video. Make sure to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Thanks for watching, guys!